Have you ever sat in silence, wondering if the people who broke your trust, betrayed your kindness, or wounded your spirit will ever be held accountable, not by you, not through revenge, but by something greater, something higher? Sometimes, when we've been hurt, the most painful part isn't just the wound. It's watching the person who caused it walk away untouched, unaffected. It feels unfair. It feels unfinished. But what if I told you that justice doesn't always look like punishment? What if God's way of dealing with those who hurt us is more profound than anything we could orchestrate ourselves? There's a sacred kind of justice that doesn't come with noise or headlines. It comes through patterns, through silence, through growth. Sometimes the clearest sign that God is dealing with those who hurt you isn't in their downfall, it's in your transformation. And while you're becoming wiser, stronger, and more whole, the people who harmed you are often stuck in the very mindset that made them hurtful in the first place. This sermon isn't about vengeance. It's about understanding the divine process that unfolds when we let go, when we stop chasing closure, and when we start trusting that nothing escapes God's awareness. If you've been wondering whether your pain has been seen, whether your tears have been heard, this message is for you. Because there are signs, subtle but unmistakable, that God is already handling it, and you don't have to carry it alone anymore. When someone who hurt you suddenly exits your life, it can feel confusing, painful, or even unfinished. We often crave closure, wanting a conversation, an apology, or at the very least, an explanation. But when none of that comes, we may be left questioning ourselves. Asterisk, did I overreact? Did I push them away? Should I have tried harder? Asterisk, these questions come from a place of vulnerability, and that vulnerability is human. But the absence of a person, especially someone who repeatedly caused harm, might not be a punishment. It could be a form of divine protection. There's something sacred about separation that isn't born from conflict, but from wisdom. When God intervenes in our lives, it's often not through loud signs or obvious retribution, but through gentle shifts that are easy to miss. One of the clearest signs that a higher power is at work is when someone who once occupied space in your life, often too much space, is quietly removed. This removal might look like ghosting, or it may come through a disagreement that doesn't escalate but simply ends the connection. No dramatic fallout, no big farewell, just silence. And in that silence, healing begins. The instinct is to chase answers. Human beings are wired for meaning, making. We want to understand what happened, why it happened, and what we could have done differently. But sometimes the answer is that you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes the answer is that this person was not meant to walk with you into the next chapter of your life. And that's hard to accept when you care deeply, especially if you're someone who gives second chances, benefits of the doubt, or empathy before boundaries. But empathy without boundaries turns into self-abandonment. And God, in wisdom, steps in when we can't yet set that boundary ourselves. When a harmful person disappears or drifts away without confrontation, it can actually be an act of divine mercy. Not because they didn't deserve to be confronted, but because you didn't need to keep being drained in the name of resolution. Some people don't offer closure because they never held enough emotional responsibility to begin with. Waiting for them to suddenly develop that self-awareness can keep you stuck in cycles of pain. So the distance becomes your gift, one you didn't ask for, but deeply needed. There's also a kind of spiritual insulation that occurs in these moments. You might begin to notice you're sleeping better. You might stop walking on eggshells. You find yourself laughing again, breathing deeper, making decisions without overthinking how they'll react. These aren't coincidences. They're signs that peace is returning not because conflict ended, but because the person who brought it was removed. That's not petty. That's protective. It's a recalibration of your nervous system, your energy, your heart. Over time, as clarity replaces confusion, you begin to see that what felt like abandonment was actually deliverance. The space that person once took up is now available for healing, for purpose, for people who love without conditions. God doesn't just remove, God restores. But the first part of restoration often looks like subtraction, not to harm you, but to prepare you. Some people are sent as lessons, others as blessings, and some are only meant to be part of your story for a season. Holding on to what was never meant to stay only delays what's coming to you next. So if someone who hurt you is no longer in your life, and you didn't get the closure you thought you needed, pause and consider. Maybe you got something better. Maybe you were protected. Maybe God stepped in not with punishment for them, but with provision for you. And maybe, just maybe, their absence is the beginning of your peace. They may look fine on social media. Their posts are curated, their smiles wide, their lives seemingly full of wins. But what you see isn't always the truth of what's happening beneath the surface. Just because someone looks like they're thriving after hurting you doesn't mean they're at peace. One of the most misunderstood things about emotional accountability is that consequences don't always show up publicly. They often show up internally, quietly, persistently, and inconveniently in places no one else can see. When someone wrongs another person, the weight of that wrongdoing doesn't vanish simply because they avoid it. It sits, it lingers, it builds over time, especially in moments when they're alone. Guilt has a unique way of sneaking up, not in the middle of a party, but in the silence of an empty room. For many, the act of harming another person disconnects them from their authentic self. And while they may suppress that disconnection temporarily through distraction, work, relationships, or even false confidence, it doesn't go away. It waits for a moment when they're less guarded. That's when it starts to speak louder through restlessness, anxiety, irritability, or even unexpected emotional breakdowns. It's common to assume that people who hurt others without apologizing are heartless or incapable of reflection. But what research and lived experience often show is something far more complex. Many people carry guilt but aren't emotionally equipped to confront it. They bury it, and buried guilt becomes emotional instability. It leaks out in defensiveness, in shallow relationships, in the inability to trust or be trusted. You might not see these consequences unfold in a headline, worthy way, but they are consequences nonetheless. There's also the emotional cost of disconnection from others. When someone mistreats people, especially those close to them, over time, they begin to lose meaningful connection. Even if they are surrounded by new friends or admirers, those bonds often lack depth. Why? Because when someone hasn't made peace with their past actions, they tend to repeat them. Their relationships become transactional, cautious, or performative, and the weight of not being truly seen or the fear of being seen and rejected takes its toll. Many people who seem unaffected by the harm they've caused are simply skilled at masking. They've learned to perform well socially, professionally, even spiritually. But performance isn't peace. There's a difference between moving on and moving forward. Someone may have moved on from the situation with you, but that doesn't mean they've moved forward in emotional maturity, character, or self-awareness. And here's where something subtle but powerful starts to happen. Their sense of inner conflict increases. Their external life may stay the same, but internally, they often begin to experience a split, a dissonance between who they pretend to be and who they know they are. That dissonance is exhausting. It affects sleep. It affects decision-making. It affects how present they can be in the moment. In fact, some people may even start to sabotage their own progress without realizing why. They'll miss deadlines, push people away, or create conflict. These patterns aren't random. They are rooted in unresolved emotional tension. And if you look closer, you'll see that they aren't as free as they appear. So while it may feel like those who hurt you got away with it, remember that not all consequences come with a dramatic reckoning. Some come as a quiet unraveling, slow, personal, and persistent. They are learning, whether they admit it or not, and what they're learning isn't your responsibility to manage or witness. Just because it's invisible to you doesn't mean it isn't happening. Emotional accountability doesn't always look like an apology or a fall from grace. Sometimes it looks like someone not being able to outrun what they've done even when no one is chasing them. When we talk about people facing what they did to us through others, we're not talking about revenge. We're talking about reflection, the way life gently, and sometimes painfully, holds up a mirror. It's easy to think that justice looks like someone being publicly shamed or dramatically punished. But most often, the way people begin to understand the harm they've caused is by living through a version of it themselves. Not because someone is out to get them, but because that's often how growth happens through experience. Let's be clear, not everyone learns from their pain. Some resist it. Some deny it. But for many people, there comes a moment where they encounter a person, a situation, or a relationship that puts them on the receiving end of the very same behavior they once directed toward others. The tone they used with you, someone now uses that tone with them. The manipulation or lack of empathy they showed, they now see how it feels when someone close to them lacks that same empathy. The disregard for your boundaries. They now struggle with someone who tramples theirs. This process doesn't usually look like an immediate aha moment. It's slow, subtle, often uncomfortable. It might take months or even years. But little by little, they begin to realize that something feels familiar, not in a nostalgic way, but in a convicting one. They start to recognize the emotional patterns. They feel dismissed, unseen, or misunderstood. And it hurts, and as strange as it sounds, that hurt might be the very beginning of their healing and yours. Now, this doesn't mean we should sit around hoping people get hurt the way we were. That's not healing. That's bitterness dressed in justification. But it does mean that we can step back and understand a larger picture that people tend to learn not just through information, but through relation. They understand pain not just by hearing about it, but by feeling it. And in that process, some of them begin to gain empathy, sometimes for the first time in their lives. It's also worth noticing how this reflection affects you. There's often a moment when you hear about what someone's going through and realize it sounds exactly like what you went through with them. And here's where the choice comes in. You can respond with bitterness or with wisdom. Wisdom doesn't celebrate their struggle, it understands it. It says, I know what that feels like, and I hope this is the moment where they finally see. This isn't always about dramatic betrayals either. Sometimes it's small things. A friend who constantly interrupted you now feels ignored. A partner who dismissed your needs now feels unheard in a new relationship. A colleague who took credit for your work now has their ideas dismissed. These moments aren't cosmic revenge. They're invitations to grow, to change, to reconcile. And this reflection doesn't guarantee change. Some people double down. They make excuses. They point fingers. They say, people are so difficult, without ever realizing they were once that difficult person to someone else. But for others, it cracks something open. It softens. It humbles. And if you're watching from a distance, it can be a strange comfort, not because they're suffering, but because life has a way of teaching lessons when we're finally ready to listen. You may never get the apology. You may never get the explanation, but there's something powerful about knowing that the universe doesn't forget, that accountability often shows up in ways we never expected, not loud and public, but quiet and personal. And in those quiet moments, people face the truth not because you forced it, but because they finally experienced it. When someone has hurt you deeply, whether through betrayal, manipulation, or emotional neglect, it's not uncommon for their voice to linger. You might hear their judgments when you try something new. You might feel their influence when you question your worth. That lingering control doesn't need their physical presence to remain active. It's internalized. It lives in the way you doubt yourself, the way you silence your instincts, or the way you hesitate to speak your truth. But here's the turning point. The influence they once had doesn't last forever. Something sacred begins to shift when healing takes root. Their influence begins to shrink, not by revenge, but through recovery. Influence isn't always about power, it's often about presence. When someone can live rent-free in your mind long after they're gone, it means they once held space in your identity. They may have shaped how you saw yourself. They may have made you feel small to make themselves feel big. But that dynamic begins to crumble as you start to question the narrative they left behind. Healing isn't just about feeling better, it's about seeing clearer. And the clearer you see, the more obvious it becomes. They weren't right about you. They never were. You may notice that the same words that used to crush you now feel empty. The same criticisms that once paralyzed you no longer hold weight. That's because influence rooted in fear only lasts as long as fear exists. Once fear is replaced with clarity, their grip loosens. That's not accidental, that's sacred. It's the result of internal work, emotional boundaries, and often divine intervention. The voice that once echoed in your head is now just background noise, fading slowly, eventually disappearing altogether. Sometimes, this loss of influence plays out externally too. The people who used to believe them stop listening. The manipulative charm they used to hold over others begins to fall apart. The control they used to exercise over conversations, decisions, or communities becomes fragile. People begin to see through it. Because influence without integrity always has an expiration date, and the expiration isn't driven by you seeking justice. It's driven by truth revealing itself in due time. What's especially powerful is that you don't have to do anything drastic to reclaim your space. You don't have to fight to be heard or prove your worth. You just have to keep growing, keep choosing honesty, keep choosing boundaries, because when you stand in your authenticity, the lies that were once spoken over you simply don't survive. Truth makes certain stories die, especially the ones told by those who needed to distort reality to stay comfortable. And here's something we don't talk about enough. The moment you no longer react to them, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually, that's when they lose access. That's when you become untouchable, not because you've built walls, but because you've built a life where their version of you no longer fits. The influence they once had cannot follow you into your healing. It can only survive where you remain wounded, and when healing starts to bloom, their control begins to rot. Some might call that justice, some might call it growth, but what it truly is alignment. Alignment with who you were meant to be before their influence took hold, before you made yourself smaller to survive them. When God begins to deal with those who hurt you, one of the most consistent signs is that their ability to shape your life and identity diminishes, and your power to reclaim your story expands. Their voice fades. Yours rises, and that quiet shift is more transformational than any loud apology or dramatic confrontation could ever be. When someone hurts us, especially in ways that feel deeply personal, it can feel unjust to see them go on with life as if nothing happened. But one of the clearest signs that something greater is at work is the contrast between your growth and their stagnation. It's not always immediate, and it's not always dramatic, but over time, a noticeable difference begins to emerge. You begin to evolve, while they stay stuck in the same patterns that led them to hurt you in the first place. That contrast is not about revenge or superiority. It's about healing. It's about alignment. When you've been wronged, there's often a moment when you feel like the pain is defining you. You're sitting in the discomfort, the confusion, maybe even the grief. But if you stay with it, if you choose to feel it instead of numbing it, process it instead of repressing it, something inside you starts to shift. You learn, you grow, you begin asking deeper questions. Why did this affect me so deeply? What parts of myself have I been ignoring? What boundaries need strengthening? These aren't easy questions, but they're powerful ones, and they open a door to emotional maturity that the person who hurt you may never choose to walk through. Growth is never linear, and it's never instant. It's uncomfortable, vulnerable, and sometimes lonely, but it creates depth. It builds compassion. It strengthens identity. When someone has wronged you and continues living on the surface, avoiding responsibility, deflecting blame, and clinging to their justifications, they may seem unaffected at first, but as you deepen, they stay shallow. As you rise in clarity, they remain clouded by denial. That difference becomes more obvious over time. It shows up in relationships, in self-awareness, in how each of you responds to future challenges. It's easy to think that growth means achieving something big, getting the last word, finding success, or proving yourself. But real growth is quieter. It's in how you handle triggers without exploding. It's in how you choose not to participate in drama. It's in how your inner world becomes more grounded and less reactive. The person who hurt you might still be chasing validation, still trying to control others, or still acting from fear. That stuckness isn't visible to everyone, but it's heavy. It keeps them circling the same emotional loops. Meanwhile, you start to feel different, not better than them. Just clearer, lighter, more yourself. You stop needing apologies that never come. You stop expecting understanding from someone who won't even face themselves. You begin to realize that justice isn't always external. Sometimes it's internal. The moment you choose growth over bitterness, reflection over retaliation, you step into a kind of freedom that can't be faked or forced. What's remarkable is that this transformation rarely comes with fanfare. No one throws a party when you start choosing boundaries. No one hands you a medal for breaking cycles. But over time, the evidence is undeniable. Your conversations shift, your friendships deepen, your energy returns. And while the person who hurt you may still be performing or pretending, you're actually healing. You're becoming more whole, and that's the sign. When someone who wronged you remains emotionally stagnant, while you begin to rise in self-respect, self-awareness, and peace, that's not a coincidence. It's a sign that God is handling it, not through punishment, but through process, not by tearing them down, but by building you up. And in that contrast, you begin to see the quiet justice of divine timing at work. So if you've been holding your breath, waiting for closure, waiting for justice, waiting for them to finally understand what they did, breathe, because God doesn't need your permission to begin the healing or the reckoning. He's already at work in ways you can't always see. Maybe it's not about them getting what they deserve. Maybe it's about you receiving what you need: peace, clarity, growth, and freedom from the weight of carrying what they did to you. You don't have to monitor their downfall to believe healing is happening. You don't need to witness their regret to know they're facing consequences. And you certainly don't need to stay stuck in pain while God is leading you toward wholeness. The signs are subtle but powerful: distance, discomfort, repetition, silence, and your own transformation. That's not coincidence. That's divine order. Let their choices remain their burden. Let your healing be your testimony. God deals with hearts, not headlines, and that includes both theirs and yours. So walk forward not in bitterness, but in trust. Because when you choose growth over revenge and peace over chaos, you're not just moving on, you're rising above. And that is the clearest sign of all.